Hello, everyone. Hi, this is Christina Caudill with Radiant Astrology. And I just want to thank you all for joining, and thank you, Linda and Olive and the whole team at EA Zoom Meetings for hosting this webinar. And not only this webinar, but all the amazing EA webinars that you host for us. Today, I have two charts that we're going to be looking at. And the topic is Chiron, the Wounded Maverick. Now, there's been a lot of talk about Chiron as the wounded healer. That tends to be the key word that we think of, or the key phrase when we think of Chiron. And there's certainly some very, deep resonance with the mythology of the wounded healer. There's also there's also like a whole other side of Chiron. And many astrologers see Chiron as the maverick, which, because of its elliptical orbit, it's also classified as a comet. So Chiron is, doesn't play by the rules. Chiron makes up its own rules. However, I don't think Chiron is either one or the other exclusively. Like any archetype, it's multidimensional, multivalent. And so we have to, number one, enter into the realm of paradox, right? Because there is that deep pain, wounding, and vulnerability that can come up with Chiron signatures. But then there can also be a rising to that occasion, that needing to heal that wound. And by doing so, we can adapt into entirely new spaces in our lives. So hopefully I can share a little bit about that through my examples. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see if I can figure this out. Okay, great. So Chiron, the Wounded Maverick. I wanted to really just look deeply into two charts. Now, I have to say, I ran out of a little time. I didn't get to go as deeply into Anna Mendieta's chart as I did with Alexander McQueen's chart, which makes me a bad feminist, I guess. But I definitely think that both of these individuals, these public figures, have a lot that they can teach us from their lives about Chiron, how they dealt with their wound of Chiron, and also found the impulse to create through that wound. Because, as we know, Chiron has recently entered Aries. And so we're all in some ways faced with this archetype of Chiron into Aries. Aries is my identity. It's who I claim myself to be. It's my will to live. And so Chiron will test us and challenge us in these ways when maybe we feel like we've lost our identity. We don't know what our identity is, but Chiron is asking us to create that for ourselves. So we've all heard the phrase, hurt people, right? Those people that have been hurt then find a target to then hurt another to help them feel powerful again, or somehow resolve the hurt. But actually, people who are hurt can also channel their pain into creativity, into passion, into art. We can channel our pain into anything we choose to, in order to find ways of healing, find ways for the soul journey to continue on its medicine walk toward healing. And so we've heard there's been so many amazing webinars in this group on Chiron, but for those of you who are maybe new and who don't really know the sort of the archetype, it's essentially, the wounded healer. Chiron was wounded, one would say mortally wounded, although he wasn't immortal. He was immortal. But the wound that he suffered, which was from a poisoned arrow, was so painful that he tried to find ways of healing it. And because he was immortal, it could never heal until he gave up his immortality. So it's about the wound that never heals, but that we always try to find ways of adapting to that wound. You know, there's the Chiron, the medicine walk that we're always on, whereas the wound is the medicine, and the medicine is within the wound. And there's a resonance with Saturnian themes and Uranian themes. And we think Saturn and Uranus couldn't be more different, right? Because Saturn is, you know, structure, tradition, the earthly realm. Uranus is about breakthrough and innovation and the future. But Chiron, as it orbits between these two planets, it is the rainbow bridge that connects them. How can we take that individuation and that breakthrough of Uranus and bring it down into the earthly realm of Saturn to create? And that is part of the beauty of Chiron. I really see Chiron as adaptation. It's adapting to the wound. It's finding a way to transcend the wound, not so that it doesn't exist, but that it doesn't hold us back, right? And so that we can then become more, or become even more whole with that wound as part of us, as an essential part of us. And Chiron being the maverick. What does it mean to be a maverick? I know in Melanie Reinhardt's book, Chiron and the Healing Journey, she says that those with Chiron, say for instance in the 10th house, right, our career and life purpose and life direction, a lot of those people tend to have, like, say they've succeeded in a career, but they didn't even have the minimum qualifications. You know, like someone who is working alongside other PhDs but doesn't even have a degree, or somebody who's running a family business but isn't even a member of the family. You know, that kind of thing, where it's like, okay, so what if I don't even have the minimum qualifications? So what if I don't fit in, or I didn't follow the rules to get where I am? I can still succeed and achieve. And so we see that in all kinds of different placements with Chiron. At least I've noticed it. And Chiron with Aries and Mars, really we're asking ourselves, who am I? Because as Chiron, again, has newly entered Aries, we want to create our own identity rather than be taking on the identity of others. Someone had said was doing a biography of Alexander McQueen, who's one of the charts I'm looking at, had said, nobody discovered Alexander. Alexander discovered himself. And I think that that is a really beautiful way of looking at this, you know, the potential of Chiron and Aries. Can we discover ourselves? Can we create a whole new paradigm of who we are that isn't following something that has come before us? And we're seeing so much happening in our world with shattered paradigms where, you know, we're clinging to, the more we cling to the path and to the past and the truth, the more lost we seem. So we're all being asked to really sort of trust our inner knowing of who we are and who we're creating ourselves to be. And with Aries and Mars, that can take some will. That can take the will that we might not think we have, but we need to find it. So, I don't know if I skipped. Let me see. I guess I didn't. So this is the chart of Alexander McQueen, who was a fashion designer. I don't know if many of you know who he was. He was British. And his natal chart, March 17th, 1969. There wasn't an exact time. So this is a solar chart, or it's actually the Aries rising chart. But I thought it kind of fit because he did have Chiron and the North Node conjunct. Chiron is at 2 Aries, the North Node is at 0 Aries, and the Sun is at 26 Pisces, right? So these I consider a conjunction. And, you know, anytime we see Chiron with the sun, there is some kind of woundedness in the self, in the idea of self, in the idea even of, the sun. Often times we think of as, who am I creating my character to be in the world? And with men, it can be about around masculinity. He was gay he said, when he came out of the womb. He always knew. He always said he never had an issue with that. That he was always sure of who he was. Was that really the truth, though? We see, Chiron with the sun, feeling some sense of woundedness or vulnerability within. But oftentimes we overcompensate and we say, oh yeah, I'm totally cool with who I am. But we do see this wounding here. Now, when he was about 8 or 9 years old, his older sister, married a man who was terribly violent. He saw his older sister get strangled and beaten. He was eventually beaten and sexually abused by this man. So, we do see this deep wounding within. He also has the ruler of his Chiron and North Node, Mars, in Sagittarius, trine that North Node in Chiron, right? So we see this, fueling of this potential resentment, potential anger, as well as, all this intense opposition here with Uranus and Jupiter along the nodes. The lunar nodes really show us a lot having to do with our path of destiny, of our growth, our spiritual growth in this lifetime. So we can already see this is an intense chart. This is also about the time, I don't remember the exact date, but remember 1969, that was when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, right? That was the last time that Chiron entered Aries. So he was born around this time where there was this heightened, worry, but also a need to change, a need to evolve in the world that was growing, like we're seeing now, right? This was a quote from him when he had gotten some flack about his designs, that people thought they were misogynistic, and we'll see a little bit more of why they might have thought that. I've seen a woman get nearly beaten to death by her husband. He probably was talking about his sister. I know what misogyny is. I design clothes because I don't want women to look all innocent and naive. I want women to look stronger. I don't like women to be taken advantage of. I don't like men whistling at them in the street. I think they deserve more respect. I like men to keep their distance from women. I like men to be stunned by an entrance. I want people to be afraid of the women I dress. So he had always maintained from early on in his career that he was, his purpose was to show the dark side of how women are treated in society and how they can look when they are powerful. So he would show some, very disturbing scenes, very theatrical in how he put on his shows. They were like theater. And at times they showed women in distress, or they showed some very intense sexual themes. But his idea is that, women no longer have to be these meek, little weak, little pretty little girls that we go through a lot as women. And it said that he identified with that sister of his who had been very badly beaten, and he made it his mission to just show men how not to treat women. So he was on a mission. He was on a crusade, as well as he was so driven to create, which we also see because he has Venus conjunct Saturn natally, I believe. Yes, he's got Venus conjunct Saturn natally. So let's see. This is, oh, I can't see what that says because it says something's covering it. Okay, this is when he let me see. This is when he started St. Martin's College. So he, let's back up here a little bit. He grew up in a council estate. So he grew up very poor with 7 brothers and sisters. And he quit school at 16 so he could become a tailor because he actually loved to sew, which was not a good thing for a boy back then in his family. But he just loved clothes. He loved to sew. And then he was so desperate for work at one point that he went into St. Martin's College, which is a really top-notch school for fashion and design. And he walked in and he said he wanted a job as a fabric cutter, just to cut fabric. Well, he showed his portfolio to the director, and she was so impressed. She said, "You're starting as a student." And there was an interview with her that she said she wasn't sure if he would make it because he didn't come in through the regular routes as everybody else. And see, there's that maverick nature there again. He came in completely, he did not have the degrees needed. He didn't have the background. He didn't have anything. He came in to one of the top fashion design schools purely on talent because he had been working as a tailor, but he had so much talent that he was accepted. And so here we see Chiron is trining his sun, transiting Chiron in Cancer, trining his sun. This is also when he said it was the first time in his life he felt he belonged somewhere. So Cancer, often we see that need and desire to belong. And then also you've got Jupiter was on the south node, also trining his sun and Chiron. I forgot to circle this, also creating a grand trine with his Mars, right? So the ruler of his north node in Chiron. And so this was a really fortunate turn of events for him to get into St. Martin's College, where he would finally get the education. And he worked really hard because 2 years later, when he was graduating and he did his MFA show, it was a huge success. I think I have that here. 1992, his MFA graduate show, he called it Jack the Ripper Stalks His Victims. Okay, so from the very beginning, he was showing about how women are basically prey to men and to men's misogyny. And so he had women in these garbs that looked like they were, ripped off and things like that. And we've got the socialite, Isabella Blow, ended up purchasing the entire collection. She loved it. All of the press in London heard about it. She introduced him to everybody he needed to know, and his career just took off like wildfire. And so there again, we see this was the 1992 event chart from his MFA thesis show. And again, we have Chiron right there in that grand trine with his Mars, that Mars fueling his creativity, his self-belief even, that Mars in Sagittarius. He never showed his vulnerability and his self-belief, but we can see that there is something there. There is this deep need probably to prove oneself, if nothing else, to prove himself to himself. Right? So we can see the Chiron maverick nature here. Chiron, transiting Chiron, is in Leo. Leo is the showman, right? And so it's saying, he probably said, this is it. I got to just give it my all. I mean, he had no money, but he probably got just enough so he could put some fabric together. But he was known for this immaculate tailoring and for some just very wild designs and, ripped clothing and things like that became his signature. And then a few years later was his show from his label, because he immediately opened a label with the help of Isabella Blow. And the title of the show was Highland Rape. Okay, you can see a theme here, right? But this show, of course, it courted controversy, which, of course, that seems to be a part of his shtick as well. But it made him an international rising star. Now, some people thought this was where he was getting the accusations of being misogynistic, or it was a sick joke, because a lot of these models were told to, they were walking down the runway like all disoriented and like they had been raped, like their clothes torn off. This woman, you can kind of see her panties there. There was some even more disturbing things in the show. But he maintained that this is the feminine experience. This is a female experience, right? He was Me Too before, way before Me Too was a thing. And what's interesting, now this work seems so timely, I would say. And the interesting thing is, he would be having his Chiron return now if he were alive. Right? Because Chiron is like a 51 year orbit. And he would be, close to his Chiron return. And so what he was speaking to was probably too early for, what society was ready for. And of course, hearing it from a man is different than women coming together. But, women are oftentimes taught to be quiet and not talk about these things. But here he was in your face, showing what it was like when a woman is, after she's raped, like being disoriented and going through the motions, of going home, like everything is normal, but, being so stunned. And I mean, where does this belong? Does this belong on a fashion runway? It's like, what is his message? But it actually, because he also had an incredible aesthetic with the actual clothes, people did start to sit up and notice and pay attention. So this was let me see. Oh yeah, so this was from that show, from the Highland Rape show. And interestingly, Chiron was right on his natal Pluto, okay, in Virgo. Virgo is about, we think about Virgo and the maiden. I'm going to quote Melanie Reinhart here again, who says that Chiron in Virgo is this struggle between the virgin and the whore, which is what Virgo symbolizes oftentimes. We're either a pure virgin and fit into society's box, or we should be considered trash and a whore and whatever, right? So women having to deal with this dichotomy, this unrealistic labeling by society of virgin or whore. And it's so interesting, because I wasn't looking specifically for transits for him. I simply was looking at highlights of his career, and then I would cast the charts. And here we have transiting Chiron right on his natal Pluto. That Pluto is our deep emotional drives, our subconscious drives, often that drive us even without us knowing, or without us being fully conscious of them. And then also transiting Pluto, approaching his Mars, that Mars in Sagittarius, that real crusader, right? So this shows a crusade. This is more than just, I'm going to show some pretty things and become famous and a star. This, to me, symbolizes someone on a crusade, someone with a real deep message, who's willing to show people the darkness of society that we may not want to be looking at. And then also, Saturn on his moon, maybe toughening up, having to really toughen up. And he took a lot of flack for this, as well as, he made his mark. But it wasn't easy, because he could have just as easily had destroyed his career. So there's so many highlights in his long life and career. Well, not very long life, but his intense career. One of them being this one called Number 13. This is considered I don't know if they call them exhibition, a fashion show that changed fashion history or something. I guess you had to be there, but essentially it was a model, Harlow, I forgot her name, but she's a really famous model, and she basically was in between these two robots who were spray painting her with paint and spray painting her dress. So creating this incredible design on her dress live there. And it became very sensual, which then became almost sexual, which then became violent. And, this was all choreographed with these robots. And again, of course, here we have another statement of the inhumane way, maybe, that women are sexualized, and how women are meant to, she almost looks like she has been in an aggressive sort of situation. And so it was shocking. It was theatrical. Those were his trademarks. But apparently this one event really solidified him in fashion history. I'd never heard of it before until I was doing this research. But when we look at these significant moments, then it's interesting to then look at the astrology and see what was it saying. Here again, it seems like whenever there's something in early Leo, it triggers a fire trine in his chart with the Chiron in the North Node and the Mars in Sagittarius. I saw this as a repeating theme. And again, Mars rules his Chiron and his North Node. And here we have the North Node of the Moon, transiting node in Leo. Again, that showmanship, triggering his, this crusader of that pain, that early wounding, that he's creating something beautiful, something shocking, something that's meant to get a conversation going, something that's remarkable. And then there's a transiting Chiron-Pluto conjunction in the sky that is on his natal Mars. Again, that Pluto and that Chiron are very significant for him in his chart, in those transits. Now, normally what I would look at is, when I'm looking at Chiron transits, one of the things I would look at is the Chiron opposition, which would have happened several years before this. And what I found from my research was during his Chiron opposition, he had his appendix burst, right? And people think he was doing a lot of drugs or working too hard or whatever. So we see Chiron a lot of times being about an actual physical wound or a healing crisis. So when Chiron was exactly opposite his natal Chiron, he had to go to the emergency room because his appendix burst. And so he spent some time in the hospital. But then, from the biography I read, he got out of the hospital and then just started working again. So that wasn't even the most significant in his life event. His focus was on getting out there and getting his message out there. And being a rebel, being a renegade. He was often called the renegade artist, right? Because his purpose was to get people talking and thinking and shake them up out of their paradigm, out of their worldview. So I just wanted to mention that, the Chiron squares, Chiron oppositions are a lot of times what we see, but because he is such a creative person, a lot of his career highlights and his career trajectory I've seen a lot with these trines, right? So we want to also be looking at Chiron trines. And they've actually activated his Chiron in the best possible way. And so, the other significant thing was he was on just such a high. He had won the Best Designer of the Year 3 years in a row. He had gotten the CBE, the British, not knighthood, but the Order of the British Commander of the British Empire or something like that. It's one of the highest honors you can get as a British citizen. He was just flying high. He was working for Givenchy, then he left Givenchy and Gucci hired him, and he was just, everything was going great for him. Now his Isabella Blow, his old friend who had helped him in the early days, she had started to feel like she was being marginalized. It was no longer about her, it was about him. She wasn't getting the accolades that he was. He had eclipsed her. And so for about a year, she was trying to commit suicide. Like she tried to get in a car crash. She tried to throw herself off a bridge or did whatever. And she finally succeeded at one time in 2007 by drinking some poison. And so, this was when Pluto was square to Alexander's sun and, North Node and Chiron, essentially. So there was this, deep metamorphosis. That tends to be something that we see signified with these Pluto transits. That need to metamorphose or whatever. And also power struggles. There could be this really intense power struggle and a need for the ego, the sun, to die in some respects, to die to a side of oneself, to be reborn anew. Right? So this affected him deeply, the suicide of Isabella. And then a few years later, his mother passes away. And then 9 days later, just because he was so distraught, he ends up committing suicide. And so we see that Uranus was coming up to his sun, to this conjunction here, the Sun North Node Chiron. And there was a transiting Sun, Chiron, Neptune, and Venus conjunction in Aquarius in the sky. And that was in conjunct his natal Pluto, right? And then Saturn was on his south node. And, I was on this stellium here. Uranus, Jupiter, and south node, right? So he had kind of a lot hitting him. What's interesting is, Aquarius, the shadow side of Aquarius is feeling alienated, feeling like you don't belong. And so, even after he'd had all of these accolades, he had made it. He was the man. This signifies that perhaps he still didn't know who he truly was. Who are you outside of your public image and your success and your achievements? If we don't spend time with our wound and with our real identity, our private identity versus just our public identity, we can find ourselves to feel empty inside or to feel lost. We can never know what goes inside the mind of someone. We can just look at these signatures and make educated guesses. But, when we look at these archetypes here, we realize that, especially when we have Chiron conjunct the sun and, on the North Node, which emphasizes it even more, that Chiron never really goes away. We can try as much as we might to deal with it and to make good in the world. But we really always need to return to the self and our own path of healing. Whereas Chiron can help us to become a maverick and to become strong and purposeful, right? And not just give in to the pain and the wound. We can also be covering up, right? We can also use all of that creativity to cover up our wound rather than face it. So that is I think that's probably one of the shadow sides of Chiron in Aries, is wanting to prove ourselves out there, having to do rather than just be, right? Because we're human beings, not human doings. And while we are here to do and to experience Earth School, ultimately, we are here to be with ourselves and to know ourselves deeply. But sometimes, when we have this, the signature of Chiron and Aries, I'm of the Chiron and Aries generation. And really, there is a big challenge of knowing the self, knowing who you truly are meant to be, and letting yourself be creative and play with that. So, this is in some ways a beautiful story about his life story, and also obviously tragic, because in the end there was something lost. There was nothing for him to cling on to. I mean, it was said that his mother's passing affected him so deeply because he so loved her and she so supported him. And I think there could have also been drugs and things like that at the time as well, which can also further cloud our sense of self and our reality in our world. But it can't be said that his life was not well lived to some degree. Now, I have just a few minutes to do the next chart, which I didn't have a whole lot of time on her. And I feel so bad because hers is amazing. She had an amazing life. Anna Mendieta. So her work revolves around the body, nature, and the spiritual connections between them. Okay, so we think about the body, right? That's very much a Mars archetype. And nature and the spiritual connection. So she's here to meld the spirit world and the physical world. A Cuban exile, Mendieta came to the United States in 1961, leaving much of her family behind, a traumatic cultural separation that had a huge impact on her art. Her earliest performances, made while studying at the University of Iowa, involved manipulations to her body, often in violent contexts. She's got Chiron in Scorpio, such as restaged rape or murder scenes. I'm not going to show you any of those, so don't worry about that. In 1973, she began to visit pre-Columbian sites in Mexico, these sacred sites, to learn more about native Central American and Caribbean religions. During this time, the natural landscape took on increasing importance in her work, invoking a spirit of renewal inspired by nature and the archetype of the feminine. And I should say I got this from the Guggenheim website. These are not my words. But, we see that this is someone who early on was wounded from being in exile from her homeland, Cuba, coming to the United States, not knowing where she belonged. She spent time in foster homes with her sister and experienced some disassociation, some alienation, some abuse. And she channeled that into her early work that did involve blood and rape and murder scenes. But then at one point, she had an awakening and began to bring more sacredness into her work, and to visit, again, these sacred sites in Mexico and the Central America and the Caribbean that really resonated with the culture that she came from. And by burying herself, like literally burying her body in the ground, or creating these landscapes, these sculptures in earth, that was her way of saying, I belong on this earth. The earth is my home. It doesn't matter my nationality, my gender, or whatever. I belong here on earth. And so her natal chart shows us, again, this is a solar chart because I didn't have a time for her. So it's the sun on the ascendant. She had a 26 degrees Scorpio sun and conjunct Chiron, just within 2 degrees. And the reason I chose a Scorpio, Chiron, and sun chart is because its Chaldean ruler, as we know, is also Mars. So here's just another way that Mars can be manifested when we talk about the Mars-Chiron archetype, right? And so now here we see, some intense things happening in this chart, especially with the Mars opposite the ancient ruler, opposite Uranus, which we can often see violence coming through those types of signatures. And Pluto, the other ruler, the co-ruler of this Sun and Chiron, in Leo, right? So that is that generational signature, that Pluto and Leo generation wanting to make their mark on the world, the me generation. And with her, it literally is about me, my body being part of my art, my body and myself having a say in, humanity's need for belonging. And, I only have about like 10 minutes left, but I will, I really implore you, if any of you who have any interest in, women's liberation or feminism, that this is a very interesting artist to follow her work. And so here are some of her siluetas, which were, in the ground, and sometimes she would even bury herself. And, here's some like fireworks. She did things, with all kinds of medium, with fire and mud and water and every medium. Oh, because I'm running out of time, we'll skip ahead to her death. She died suddenly. She was only about, I think, not even 40. And she was in her apartment with her lover, the artist Carl Andre. She had moved to New York. Her career was going amazingly well. She was, she'd had exhibitions at some of the top galleries and museums in New York. And one day she fell off of her balcony and died. And there seems to be a lot of belief in the art world that it was Carl Andre that threw her off of her balcony, that murdered her. I mean, what do we know? We can guess from the chart, and we can see, the signatures that we think we might see. We see Pluto is on her south, transiting Pluto on her south node. Again, these are solar houses, so if you use solar houses, that would be the 12th house. And the south node on her Mercury in Scorpio, right? So definitely some kind of twist of fate. And Mars squaring her sun, Chiron, right? The ruler of her sun, Chiron, squaring it by transit. And the fact that she has a sun Chiron, right? Some deep inner wound. It could have been suicide. Could that be suicide? But that doesn't necessarily mean it had to be suicide. All we know is, and transiting Chiron on her moon. Some deep wounding to her feminine nature, her needs. Maybe they say, the rumor is there was a lover's brawl, lover's fight, and he threw her off the balcony. And essentially what had happened was she died and Carl Andre got away with it, and his career succeeded. He was a top artist at the time in the 80s, and he continued to be. And that did not sit well with especially women in the art world, women artists and other women who said, this is just not okay. And so there have been many protests against his work, which really didn't do anything, unfortunately, because he still was considered, a significant, successful artist. This was actually recent. This was in 2016. There was an exhibition at the Tate Gallery in London of Carl Andre's work. And many women came out to protest, artists came out to protest. I wish there was more guys out there too, but I guess this is a woman thing. But it was pretty clear that, at least by many people's standards, that he never faced anything from her death. So even in death, her crusade lives on. Her crusade of women's rights and women's need to belong and be, not only belong, but be respected, continues to this day, really. And the funny thing is, I don't know why the powers that be still don't seem to listen, because Carl Andre seems to, his career anyway, his artwork seems to still be in many public collections and private collections. Oh, so what was really significant about this was some kind of major exhibition at the Tate, where they own both Carl Andre's work and Anna Mendieta's work, yet they showed Carl Andre's work and kept Anna's work in storage. So yeah, that didn't sit too well with these activists. Now, I did not have a chance to cast that chart. I'm so annoyed that I didn't, because I want to look and see, because I can pretty much guarantee her natal chart would be activated. But let's see, when we look at, this signature here of Scorpio, well, Jupiter, right? Jupiter in Scorpio is contacting, her Scorpio planets, right? So even after death, we tend to see public figures, when their charts are being activated by the transiting planets, we can see something from them coming through. So Anna Mendieta, even from the beyond, is encouraging the Me Too movement and encouraging women to stay strong. So how am I doing on time, Linda? I think I'm pretty much made it.
Sorry, 10 minutes to go.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, then can I take some questions? If anybody has any questions, I can do that.
Christina, could you stop your share?
Oh, let's see. How do I
take us back to the gallery? Okay, great.
Okay.
Okay, any questions, anyone?
I saw some in the chat earlier. Oh.
Hi.
Oh, Shalom Harlow. Thank you, Linda. That was Shalom Harlow, the spray paint dress model. Yes. Yeah, I knew I was getting like part of her name right. But yeah, I just wanted to say, if there aren't any questions, that...
well, there is a question. Yes, Carolyn, go ahead.
Hi, Christina. How are you?
Hi, Carolyn.
Hi.
Oh.
I have Chiron natally conjunct Mars in the 7th, And I'm wondering if with Chiron going into Aries, it will have a double effect or any effect.
What sign is your Chiron?
Scorpio.
Oh, okay. Chiron conjunct Scorpio in the 7th. And then what was the question? I'm sorry.
Okay, so Chiron is conjunct Mars, so it's related to Aries, and it's in Scorpio. So with Chiron going into transiting into Aries, I'm wondering if you have anything to say to that.
Yeah, well, because Mars is, the co-ruler. I mean, even though I'm a modern astrologer, I can't help but see the correlations with Chiron. I mean, with Mars being, the ancient ruler of Scorpio, as well as, the ruler of Aries. So, Linda. Oh, there you are. Oh, that's your chart. Oh, that's so helpful. Thank you, Linda, because I hate to talk about a chart when I don't see the whole picture. Well, first of all, okay, there's several things. What I would be looking at more for you is when, we're going to have a Venus retrograde in Scorpio later this year.
Okay.
I don't know if it's going to quite make it to your Chiron, and I think it might, because I know it goes from the end of Libra mostly through Scorpio and then back again. And so let's see, where's your Venus at? And you have Venus in Leo. Ooh, you've got that big Venus there.
and I've got transiting Jupiter sitting on my Chiron.
Yes, exactly. Okay, because that's my North Node. So I would say, if anything, so you've had a big transit of Chiron, right, from over this past year, and
yes,
and I'm sorry, of Jupiter over your Chiron, and then Jupiter is retrograding, and then so Jupiter's not done with you yet here.
No.
And so so that already we're looking at the expansiveness of your Chiron. And they say that Jupiter can sometimes bring challenges as well. We think of it as, this great ease and expansiveness, which it can do. But, in Scorpio, as we've seen, it can be sort of like the Pandora's box. It can be a lot.
Done that. Mm-hmm. And now I feel that physically and mentally I'm healing. I'm in good shape. I really am, all things considered.
All things considered. Okay, and so with Chiron going into Aries, let's see, what else will it? It's going to oppose, eventually it'll oppose your sun. But you, with your Chiron going into, or it's in your 12th house, then that is doing that deep internal work of, who am I at, how did I become who I am? Those questions about why am I, maybe more than just the who, but the why am I why am I the way I am? And how did I become who I am? And those are questions worth pursuing, even if there's never, a definitive answer. It's just in that pursuit you'll find what you need, because eventually when Chiron opposes your sun, you're going to want to, usually there is some kind of a letting go of something else, maybe a relationship or a toxic relationship or someone in your life or something that's been causing you pain, and you finally find a way to release it. That could be one potential of it.
For sure. Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Linda, for these charts. That's super helpful.
Oh, no problem. I think there's a question in the chat. Can you see the chat there? From Jen Baptist. That'll be the last question.
Oh, yes, Jen. Hi, Jen. There was a time when Uranus was opposite Chiron and Aries in 74. Yes. Any thoughts on Uranus just leaving Aries as Chiron enters? You know what? there was actually a few different phases of the Uranus opposite Chiron, but definitely the ones in like the early 70s, I think it is when it was exact, up to 74. When I get clients like that, I often see that they'll say they have so much that they want to do and to share, and they have all this wisdom and these brilliant insights, but they don't know where it belongs, like either in their life or in the world, or how can it serve. But the thing is that is the journey, is to follow those brilliant insights. You know, I think about, like, if, I don't know, Steve Jobs ever thought like his ideas just didn't have a place in society, you know? I mean, you find the place, you follow your brilliant insights that are probably ahead of their time. And sometimes that may come with challenge or controversy or people not getting you, or that alienation feeling, right? But your task is to continue on that journey, follow it along, find where the healing is, the healing potential is in that which it is that you're pursuing. You know, so it's usually something to do with, when we think of Chiron being about healing and Uranus being about evolution, you know, something that's evolutionary that can be of benefit. I've also often seen, I actually just recently saw it again from a client, where she had been dealing with so much sorrow and grief and, you know, just this gnawing sense of guilt and pain over something with one of her children that just wasn't going away. And then when Chiron entered Aries, it was like, boop, she let it go. It was just gone in an instant. And she's just, I'm not going to question it. I'm just going to go with it. And that's kind of, you know, that Chiron opposite Uranus can be a sudden breakthrough, a sudden knowing, or a sudden letting go of trauma, you know, and just not considering or worrying that it has to come back or it has to anything. It's just, it is what it is. That maybe you've processed enough and now is time for it to just be gone like that. There's one more question. Do I have time for one more?
Yes.
Or no, she just said thank you. She basically said, thanks for introducing me the idea of Chiron as a wounded maverick. My son is in Sag and also conjunct Chiron. Oh, so that's definitely the Crusader Maverick. And it's Zane Stein's book is Chiron. I forgot what the subtitle is, but Zane Stein has written about Chiron being a maverick planet. And it was actually Charles Kowal who discovered Chiron, called it the Maverick because of its highly unusual orbit. So that's definitely something that you might want to look more into. But thank you for those of you that came on. And I apologize for my disorganization this time, but hopefully you found some very interesting insights in today's presentation.
Great, Christina. Thank you so much. Would you all please thank Christina Caudill, everybody?
Thank you, Christina. Wonderful as always.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.